Hello and welcome back to another Learn to Code series. This one will be in HTML, CSS, and the use of something called classes. As you see in front of you, this is Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. This is a public domain book, and I will show you about how I added color, or in this case, a little bit of interactivity, into this content. And all of this code, as well as other codes, can be found in the Learn to Code GitHub, which I will leave links below to the video about how to use the GitHub as well as where it is. But we'll kind of just dive right into things. So here we have the code. In this example, I would say 75% of it is probably all comments, which is really just instructions that are ignored by the computer and mainly meant for people that explain what the example is, how it works. I will not read through these. I assume you can read, and I will save you the time. But I will talk about the decisions that were made and how things work in a different perspective. So the comments are really meant to kind of augment. So up here I have the CSS, all the styling. I will come to this next, but it just is normally in the top of the document. If I scroll all the way to the bottom, so we have the HTML. So we have an H1 tag, we have a div, which I am giving it the class of chapter. It has a title, chapter 1. And within that div, I have another class, which is header. So ultimately, class is an attribute that can be added to any HTML element. And what it does is it adds kind of like a tag. So if you wanted to say that all cars had 4 wheels, then you could, a car is a class of object, whereas your specific car that you get in and drive is a very specific, unique, that would be more of an identifier or an ID. So a class is, dogs. Dogs are a class, cats are a class. You can define things however you want. So I have more classes here. I have a subheader. I have a class drop cap. And we'll talk a little bit about that and what that is. And then we have a class for red, a class for green, a class for blue over here. And later on, I have 2 different classes. So I have red and disappear. Any element may have multiple classes assigned to it, and the only thing you have to have is a space between them. And that does mean that you can't have spaces in your name. So red disappear is not one class name, that's 2. It's one for red and another one for disappear. I have another class here, green disappear. I have a class here, emphasis. I have a class emphasis, red and blue. So I'm going to show how you can work with combined classes and how regular classes would work should you have 2 that have conflicting information. And another emphasis. So this is just your basic HTML marked up with some classes in it. If I go all the way to the top, I can go through some of these classes. So first, let's start with the basics. So for green, I'm using the RGB color, so red, green, blue. I'm giving it 0 red, 255 green, which is the highest number value when using RGB, and 0. So this would be bright green. For red, I'm doing bright red, and for blue, I'm doing bright. So as we see, our red is bright red, our green is bright green, and our blue is bright blue. So moving on, we had our class emphasis. So emphasis means you want to give a lot of weight to a specific word or phrase. And here we have something called font weight. So font weight defines how thick the font is going to be. So I note in the comments about how you can change the values using numbers between 1 to 800. In this case, I've used a keyword, and the keyword is bold, and bold, I believe, is 600. Comments. Bold is normally 600. So if I put bold or 600, it would be the same value. But I think bold is a little bit more readable, especially for if you're not familiar with what the numbers mean. If I take a look at emphasis, so I can see, okay, this had emphasis on it. set emphasis. So that is a thicker font, so it kind of pops out. So I have a class for the smaller text. So we had some text that we wanted to be a little bit smaller. In this case, I changed the font size. So I used a different notation than normal here. Well, a different notation than I normally use. This is a fairly standard and common notation, and it's an EM. EM is a relative notation. So it takes whatever font size it would normally think it is and then multiplies it by that number. So 1 EM would mean keep it exactly the same font size. 2 EM would be twice as big. So in this case, I said 0.9, so 90% of the normal size. And I'm adding a text decoration of underline. So whatever I defined as smaller text will be underlined. If I scroll down, I see here I have text that's slightly smaller. It might be a little hard to see that it's smaller, but it is, and it's underlined. So this is the text there. So now we have an interesting thing. Below I had one class or one HTML object that had two different classes in it. It had red and blue. So if I didn't define this, if I took this out, CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And what that means is that everything is interpreted from the top to the bottom. So if you write something below something else, it will change it. So if I have, for example, .red and then color RGB, so red, green, blue, and then I do red color. Let's make it so we can see. So red. So if I do this, what's going to happen is this red is going to be overwritten by this red because it's cascading. So it's the order in which you provide it. So if I save this, go back and reload my document, and I look, so now my reds are blues. So what happens is, I'll remove this, get everything back to normal. So in the case of having two different classes, if I left this alone, since I defined red first, then blue, what would happen is anything that I had red and blue, it would go with blue, because blue was the most recent. But what I can do is I can combine them. So I can say if red and blue are found together, so that notice that there's no space between these two. So this is what it's looking for, is the existence of both red and blue. So in this case, I take my color and I give it red, blue, and green. So in this case, I probably should do red and blue. And that would probably make a little more sense. So red, blue, and green. And I'm going to give it two different colors, so it's going to change its color. I will save that. And okay, that's why I changed it. It is a very horrid color of yellow, which is probably extremely difficult to see. So let's change that back just so you can see. That was yellow. So back. And now, so we've got a purple. So in the case that I have now the two classes, so you can combine things. And then moving forward, what you can also do is you can define something for multiple classes. So we had a red, we had a blue, and we had a green. And I could write in each one of those. So in red, I could put font size 1.2 EM. I could put that in green. I could put that in blue. But I would get, especially if I had 5 or 6 properties, that could get very cumbersome. And also, if I ever wanted to change things and say, you know what, I want to change for all of these, I want to just change it once, you can do that. So in here, there's just a simple comma. So whereas up here, we have no space between them, and that means combine them. Right here, we're using a comma, so it says for red, comma, blue, comma, and green, apply a font size of 1.2 EM. So as we talked about before, EM is relatives. That means 1.2 of its normal size, which would be 20% larger. Quickly switch back. we'll see that everything that's colored is just a little bit larger than everything else. So now we have our disappear. So I talked about that before. So CSS and selectors, this really isn't related to classes. I just kind of wanted to throw something cool and fun in here. So what has been added is for disappear, I've added a transition that takes place over 0.5 seconds. So you define how long you want the transition to last, and that will say whenever a property changes, so if the color changes, if the size changes, anything, how long should it take that change to happen? So in this case, 0.5 seconds. And then down here, I have something called a pseudo class, and the pseudo class uses a colon. And there's a few keywords. So there's like hover, there's active for links, there's viewed, etc. I will, in a much later time, go through all the different pseudo classes, but for now, I just wanted to show the hover one. So in this case, if it has a class of disappear, using the period, and we have the colon, so the pseudo class of hover, change the opacity to 0. So that basically means make it look like it's hidden. So make it completely transparent. If I go back to the coding, and I believe, yeah, here we go. So in this case, if I put my mouse over it, so if I hover, then it becomes opacity 0. I feel like there's one, add that. There we go. So you can do this over a whole giant section. Doesn't have to be a word. So whatever has that class. The last concept that I'm going to be talking about is a drop cap. So a drop cap is a commonly used concept within writing and within books. And what a drop cap is it's this thing here. Now this is not the prettiest designed drop cap. But if the text were to scroll around, it would go then below text. So this is dropped within the line, because normally if I just made this large, it would go above the line. So it is now dropped below the normal line level, and it is a capital letter. So that's why it's called a drop cap. To do the drop cap, I'm using the pseudo class of first letter. So first letter selects, as it sounds, the first letter. So I can have an entire paragraph with the class drop cap, yet it will only apply the styles to the first letter within there. So I have a float left. This is a fairly complex concept, and I don't really want to get into it right now, but you just kind of have to trust that this is required. It allows the letter to float within the box model. We have a font size. So in this case, I put 5 EM. So we talked about EM being relative, and this means 5 times the normal size. We set our line height to be 90%. So line height refers to how big the line is going to be that this exists on. So we actually want to make that a little smaller, and that is actually why the A is a little bit above this line, and it's going to give us room below it when it's time to write that. So you can play with this, you can make this bigger or smaller, and it will adjust how the height of this drop cap. And then we have a padding right of 2 pixels. So padding gives the letter or the contents spacing. It gives it room to breathe. If you didn't have that, then it would butt right up next to the items next to it. So in this case, there's a little bit of room between here and here, and that's just 2 pixels. It's very small, but it gives you room. If you didn't have that, then this text would be really, really close to there. So that is it. And as I said, there is much better descriptions, or there's additional descriptions as to what everything is and how it works if you read the comments here in all the CSS. And all of this is available on the GitHub repository, so you can download it, you can play with it. You don't have to try and write this all down. And thank you very much, and consider subscribing or liking if you would like to hear about new content when it comes out. Thank you very much.